It was the kind of March morning that lingered in the bones, a damp grey chill that wrapped itself around Dublin and seemed to soften the edges of everything. The air held a faint brine from the nearby coast, carried inland by a breeze that promised rain before the day was done. In the small apartment she shared with two friends in Sandymount, 26-year-old Annie McCarrick moved quietly through her routine. She was an early riser by habit, and that morning was no different. Kettle on, tea poured, the faint hum of the radio in the background. There was nothing to suggest that this Friday, the 26th of March 1993, would be the day she vanished from the face of the earth. Annie wasn't Irish by birth, though many mistook her for one after hearing the lilt in her voice. She had been born and raised in New York, the only child of John and Nancy McCarrick. Ireland had been a dream of hers for years, a place she had visited before, fallen in love with, and promised herself she would return to. And she had kept that promise. Just months earlier, she had moved permanently to Dublin, working in a cafe, studying and immersing herself in the rhythm of Irish life. Friends described her as gentle but adventurous, the sort of person who could strike up a conversation with a stranger and leave them smiling. That Friday was supposed to be a day off. She'd made vague plans to head into the Wicklow Mountains, a place she'd often talked about exploring further. Annie had a fascination with the natural beauty just south of the city, the rolling hills, the forests, the way the sea could still be seen from certain high points. But she didn't tell anyone precisely where she'd be going. In fact, most of what is known about her movements that day comes from fragments, scattered sightings, partial conversations, and the faint trail she left behind before it disappeared altogether. Just before midday, Annie withdrew a small sum of money from her bank account at an ATM in Sandymount. Surveillance cameras weren't common in Ireland at the time, and no photograph was captured. From there, she was reportedly seen boarding a bus bound for Enniskerry, a picturesque village at the edge of the Wicklow foothills. It was a popular spot for walkers, with quaint shops and a gateway to some of the country's most scenic hiking trails. The weather was brisk but clear, and locals remembered the day as one of those fleeting breaks between long stretches of rain. Witness accounts diverge after that. A shopkeeper in Enniskerry claimed to have seen her browsing in the late afternoon, dressed casually in jeans, boots and a warm jacket, her long brown hair tucked behind her ears. Another reported seeing her further along the road toward the Dublin mountains, possibly heading for a place known as Johnny Fox's, a well-known pub famous for its traditional music and hearty food. It was the kind of place Annie might have liked, though it sat alone on a winding road miles from the nearest bus stop. What's certain is that no one who knew Annie ever saw her again. When she didn't return home that evening, her flatmates assumed she'd stayed out late, or perhaps decided to spend the night elsewhere. It wasn't until the next morning that concern began to grow. Calls went unanswered. Friends hadn't seen her. By the following day, when she failed to show up for a shift at work without explanation, her absence could no longer be brushed aside. Her parents were contacted in New York, and within days they were on a plane to Dublin, stepping into a mystery that would never release its grip. The initial police response was procedural but restrained. Annie was an adult, they reasoned. She could have chosen to go off for a while, to take time to herself, but to those who knew her, this explanation rang hollow. Annie wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to vanish without a word. She kept in close contact with friends and family, and she was careful, especially when travelling alone. In those first few days, searches were conducted in and around Enniskerry, the surrounding countryside, and along the route to Johnny Fox's. Flyers bearing Annie's smiling face were tacked to lampposts and shop windows. Locals were questioned, taxi drivers interviewed, bus timetables scrutinised. The trail, such as it was, ended in a fog of uncertainty somewhere between the village and the mountains. Her parents, John and Nancy, found themselves walking the narrow, winding roads she might have taken, their footsteps echoing in the damp air. They spoke to anyone who might have seen her, repeating the same description again and again until the words blurred. They learned quickly that in missing persons cases, time is an unforgiving enemy. Every hour that passed without a lead made the chances of finding her smaller. In the years that followed, Annie's name would join a haunting list. Women who disappeared in Ireland in the 90s under circumstances that seemed both random and eerily similar. Some began to suspect that the cases were connected, that a single shadow might stretch over them all. But in those first days of April 1993, the focus was simply on finding her, on retracing her last known steps in the hope that one overlooked detail might break the silence. No such detail came. The Wicklow Mountains stood as they always had, indifferent and unyielding, their slopes and forests swallowing sound and time alike. The roads wound on, the pub still welcomed visitors, the buses still ran to Enniskerry, but Annie McCarrick was gone, leaving behind only questions that seemed to multiply with the passing years. And somewhere between the city and the mountains, a piece of her story, maybe the most important piece, slipped quietly out of sight. The days after Annie's disappearance unfolded in a haze of uncertainty, each one stretching longer than the last. Dublin in late March can be deceptive. The mornings are cold enough to cloud your breath, but by afternoon the air softens just enough to let hope sneak in. That hope kept her parents moving, kept them walking the streets and country lanes where she might have passed, scanning every face in every crowd for a flicker of recognition. They carried her photograph everywhere, a warm, open smile, the kind of face you could imagine trusting. They had dozens of copies printed, handing them out in pubs, bus stations, and small shops. Most people accepted the leaflets politely, some offering faint recollections. None could give the certainty they so desperately needed. The Gardaí began to widen the search. Officers retraced the route from Sandymount to Enniskerry, questioning anyone who might have seen her. Bus drivers were interviewed, though records from that day were incomplete. Several said they thought they remembered her, tall, slim with long brown hair, speaking in an American accent. But memories are fragile things, especially when they're asked to bear the weight of certainty weeks after the fact. One driver was sure he had dropped her off in Enniskerry. Another thought she had boarded his bus but couldn't recall where she got off. The witnesses in the village itself were just as uncertain. A few locals described seeing someone matching her description walking toward the mountain road that led to Johnny Fox's pub, though no one could confirm whether she ever arrived. That pub loomed large in the early investigation, not just because it was her possible destination, but because of its setting. Perched high in the Dublin mountains, it was remote, the kind of place you'd only get to by car, on foot, or with determination. On a clear night, the views from the hilltop were breathtaking, but the journey there was not without risk. Narrow, twisting roads wound through stretches of forest and open bog, where shadows gathered early and lingered late. If Annie had gone there, someone would have had to see her. Yet no staff member recalled her being inside, and no patrons came forward to say they had shared a table, or exchanged a word. In the absence of solid sightings, the theories began. One of the most immediate was that she might have accepted a lift from someone, perhaps someone she knew, or perhaps a stranger who seemed trustworthy enough in the moment. The idea chilled her parents, not because it was implausible, but because it was entirely possible. Annie was friendly, and though careful by nature, she was also the kind of person who believed in kindness, in the better intentions of others. The Gardaí searched nearby woodlands, rivers and trails, bringing in dogs and volunteers to comb the terrain. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the ground for any sign of a movement or disturbance. The searches came back empty. No dropped belongings, no footprints in the damp earth, no scraps of fabric caught on a branch. The land seemed to have swallowed her whole. In New York, the news of Annie's disappearance spread quickly through her old neighborhood. Friends from school and college sent messages to her parents, sharing memories and offering prayers. Many couldn't reconcile the image of the bright, capable young woman they knew with the thought of her simply vanishing on a day trip. Those who had visited Ireland themselves understood the distances involved, the way rural roads could narrow and grow quiet so quickly. A wrong turn, a single unfortunate encounter, and the world could change in minutes. Back in Ireland, Annie's case began to appear in local papers, often tucked between larger headlines. Her face stared out from the pages, sometimes paired with a grainy photo of the Wicklow landscape, a reminder of the beauty and isolation of the place she had been headed. Journalists framed it as a mystery, but there was an undertone of unease. The 1990s had already seen several disappearances of women in and around Dublin, each with its own peculiar gaps and unanswered questions. It was too soon to say whether Annie's fate was part of a larger pattern, but the thought was there, unspoken in official statements but murmured in quieter conversations. Her parents, meanwhile, refused to leave Ireland. They set up a base in Dublin, making daily trips to the areas where she might have been. They retraced the walk from the bus stop to the village shops, from the shops toward the road to the mountains. They timed how long it took to walk each stretch, how quickly the traffic thinned, how isolated certain bends became. Sometimes they would stop and just stand at the roadside as if waiting for her to appear. One evening, a heavy fog rolled in from the coast, blanketing the village in a damp, muffled quiet. John and Nancy stood outside the bus stop, the lamps glowing faintly through the mist. "This is what it would have been like," Nancy whispered, thinking of her daughter walking alone on such a night. The road beyond disappeared into a wall of pale grey, and for a moment it was easy to believe that a person could simply step into it and be gone. The Gardaí kept the case open, following every tip, no matter how slight. But for each call they received, a possible sighting, a vague recollection, another would fade away, disproven or too insubstantial to act upon. Days turned to weeks, and the certainty they had hoped for never came. Somewhere in that stretch between Enniskerry and the Dublin mountains, the truth was waiting. But like the mist that came down over the hills, it seemed to shift and retreat whenever they drew near. By the time April settled over Ireland, the landscape around Enniskerry had shed the sharp chill of March and taken on the softer, greener tones of spring. But for Annie's family, the changing season brought no relief. Each day without an answer deepened the weight they carried, a heaviness that seeped into their movements, their speech, even their sleep. Dublin streets were still unfamiliar to them, yet they navigated them with the focus of people who had no choice but to keep moving forward. The Gardaí continued to work the case, but in those early weeks, their efforts were still framed by a belief that Annie might have left voluntarily. It was a possibility they couldn't rule out, though to those who knew her, it felt all wrong. Annie had spoken often about her love for Ireland, but she had no reason to vanish. She'd been building a life in Dublin, she had a job she enjoyed, friends she trusted, plans for the summer ahead. Her parents pressed the investigators to look harder at the possibility of foul play, but in the absence of evidence, the case straddled an uneasy line. As April wore on, the search expanded beyond Enniskerry. Officers canvassed rural pubs and small shops throughout the foothills, asking the same questions, showing the same photograph. Some thought they'd seen her, a tall young woman with an American accent, ordering tea, chatting casually, but when pressed for details the memories unravelled. Had it been Annie, or simply someone who looked like her? In a small country, faces become familiar quickly, but they also blur in recollection. One potential lead drew investigators up into the Dublin mountains, along a narrow winding road where the hedgerows crowded close to the tarmac. A man claimed he had given a young woman a lift that Friday, picking her up on the outskirts of Enniskerry. She'd been friendly but quiet, he said, and had mentioned heading toward Johnny Fox's. The description matched Annie: jeans, boots, a dark jacket, but there was no way to confirm it. The man didn't recall her name, and he couldn't remember exactly what time he'd seen her. Even if his account was true, it left more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate about a troubling pattern. Annie was not the first woman to disappear in or near Dublin in recent years. Others had gone missing during ordinary daily routines, walking home, meeting friends, taking solitary trips. Some were later found, their deaths unexplained. Others were never recovered at all. Local journalists began referring quietly to the Vanishing Triangle, a stretch of land in Eastern Ireland where the disappearances seemed clustered. There was no official acknowledgement of a link, but the sense of unease was growing. For Annie's parents, the theories were less important than the search itself. They kept retracing her possible route, walking from the bus stop in Enniskerry to the edge of the mountain road, timing each stretch, noting each bend where someone could stop a car without being seen from the village. They asked strangers if they'd seen her, sometimes approaching the same people twice without realizing it. The repetition was exhausting, but it was all they had. There was one place they returned to again and again, a bend in the road about halfway between Enniskerry and Johnny Fox's. From there you could see the hills rising ahead and the valley dropping away behind. On a bright day the view was stunning, the air fresh with the scent of heather and pine. But in poor light it felt different, narrower, more enclosed, the hedgerows forming high walls on either side. If Annie had walked this road alone, the thought of her meeting the wrong person here was too easy to imagine. The Gardaí began discreet checks on individuals known to live in the area, men with histories of violence or harassment, or those whose names had appeared in other investigations, but nothing solid emerged. The countryside here was dotted with small farms and hidden driveways, and it was possible for someone to move unnoticed. In Dublin, Annie's absence began to ripple through her circle of friends. They organised small gatherings to share information, to comfort each other, to try to make sense of what had happened. Some clung to the hope that she had simply taken time for herself, that she might still walk back through the door. Others couldn't shake the darker possibilities. At night, John and Nancy would return to their small hotel room. The leaflets and maps spread across the desk, the kettle steaming in the corner. They spoke less as the days went on, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were both thinking the same thing, that they were moving through a narrowing space where the chance of finding their daughter alive was slipping away. The hills outside still held their quiet beauty, but for the McCarricks, they had become something else entirely, a place where their daughter's trail had vanished, leaving behind only the sound of the wind moving through the hedgerows and the knowledge that somewhere someone knew why. By May, the McCarricks had been in Ireland for over a month, and the relentless routine of searching was beginning to wear into their bones. Each morning started the same way: a quiet breakfast, a review of maps, and phone calls to anyone who might have new information. Then came the long hours on the road, walking the same paths, visiting the same shops and pubs, speaking to the same people in the hope that repetition might jog a memory. The faces of locals had grown familiar, but the answers remained the same. No, I haven't seen her. No, I don't know anything. The Gardaí maintained their inquiries, but the pace had slowed. Without fresh leads, officers were left following the thin strands of information that already existed, hoping something would hold. The possible sighting of Annie near Johnny Fox's still lingered as the most promising, though it was far from confirmed. The pub itself remained a focal point for speculation. On certain nights it were bustling, full of music and conversation, but during the day, especially in the off-season, the surrounding roads could feel desolate. It was a place you went to deliberately, not somewhere you'd pass through by chance. Investigators quietly explored whether Annie had arranged to meet someone there. Friends and colleagues were questioned again, asked if she had mentioned new acquaintances or casual invitations in the days before she vanished. Most couldn't recall anything unusual, but one friend did remember Annie talking about possibly going to Johnny Fox's for live music. The friend wasn't sure if she'd planned to go alone or meet others. That uncertainty hung over the investigation like a shadow. The idea that Annie might have known her abductor, if abduction was what had happened, began to take hold among those close to her. She was naturally trusting, warm in conversation, but not reckless. It was unlikely she would have gotten into a car with a complete stranger on a rural road, unless she felt some degree of safety. That thought led to another. If she did know the person, perhaps they were someone she'd only met recently, someone the Gardaí hadn't yet identified. Around this time, the McCarricks learned of another troubling case. A young woman who had vanished from the greater Dublin area in recent years under similarly unclear circumstances. And then another. In isolation, each disappearance was tragic but explainable. A voluntary departure, an accident, foul play by an unknown party. But together they began to form a darker pattern, a suggestion that perhaps the danger was not random at all. The press picked up on the unease. Articles began to appear with Annie's photograph alongside those of other missing women, each image paired with a short biography and the last known details of their day. These weren't yet sensational stories, but the tone was shifting. Reporters began asking whether something larger was happening, though the Gardaí offered no official comment. Annie's case was still classified as a missing person investigation, not a criminal one, but the unspoken fears were clear. In the meantime, her parents faced a painful reality. They couldn't stay in Ireland indefinitely. Their lives back in New York, jobs, bills, a home, still existed, even if they felt impossibly far away from relevance. But leaving without answers was unthinkable. They discussed renting a small flat in Dublin, a more permanent base from which to continue their search. Friends back home offered to organise fundraisers to cover costs, and strangers, moved by the story, began sending small donations. One afternoon, while walking near the edge of the Wicklow foothills, Nancy paused at a sharp bend in the road. The valley below was quiet, the wind carrying the faint scent of wild gorse. She imagined Annie here, walking with her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, glancing up at the hills ahead. The scene was almost peaceful, until the thought intruded of how quickly such peace could shatter. The physical searches began to taper off by early summer. The Gardaí had covered the key areas multiple times, each sweep yielding nothing new. Without fresh evidence, they could not justify the same level of manpower indefinitely. For the McCarricks, this was devastating. The silence around the case was deepening, and with it came the creeping fear that Annie's disappearance might one day be considered unsolvable. But there was one thing they were certain of. Annie had not simply walked away from her life. Somewhere between Sandymount and the Dublin Mountains, something had happened, and someone, perhaps someone who passed her on a quiet road that afternoon, knew exactly what it was. Even if they never spoke, the land still remembered. The roads, the hedgerows, the valleys. They had seen her last steps. And in that silence, the McCarricks found themselves listening harder than ever, hoping that one day the truth would speak. Summer in Ireland had a way of softening the hard edges of the land. The hedgerows grew thick and green, the air warmed just enough to carry the scent of grass and earth, and the days stretched long into pale evenings. But for the McCarricks, the change in season only marked the passage of time without answers. It had been more than 3 months since Annie disappeared, and the initial urgency that once drove the investigation now felt dulled by repetition. The Gardaí continued their inquiries, but the sense of forward momentum had slowed to a crawl. For John and Nancy, each day was still devoted to the search. They had settled into a small rented flat on the outskirts of Dublin, its walls lined with maps, notes, and the countless flyers they continued to distribute. Their daily routine had become almost ritualistic, revisiting key locations, speaking to locals, following up on tips no matter how small. Even the faintest lead was pursued, because in the absence of clear evidence, any possibility had to be treated as if it could be the one that mattered. Some tips were hopeful at first, but quickly unravelled. A reported sighting of Annie at a seaside cafe south of Dublin turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Another tip suggested she'd been seen boarding a ferry bound for Wales, but passenger records showed no match. Each false lead was a blow, but it also hardened their resolve. The most enduring thread remained the possible journey from Enniskerry toward Johnny Fox's pub. That stretch of road took on a haunted quality for them, a place where the gap in her timeline loomed largest. They drove it slowly again and again, noting every pull-off, every lane that branched into the woods, every blind curve where a car could stop unseen. It was a route of possibilities and dangers. Around this time, whispers about the so-called vanishing triangle began to solidify into public discussion. Between 1993 and 1998, several young women had gone missing within a broad swathe of Eastern Ireland, many last seen in rural or semi-rural areas. There was no official statement linking the cases, but journalists began charting their disappearances on maps, pointing out the unsettling proximity of some of the locations. Annie's name appeared often in those articles, and while the McCarricks avoided speculation in public, they could not ignore the eerie similarities. There was also the question of Annie's state of mind in the days before she disappeared. Friends told investigators she had seemed happy, settled, and excited about her life in Dublin. She had spoken about future plans, a trip to see friends, continuing her studies, maybe even moving into her own place. There had been no signs of distress or withdrawal, no hint that she was planning to leave abruptly. By July, the McCarricks had grown used to the quiet rhythm of rural Ireland, the way afternoons in the foothills could pass without seeing another person, the way darkness seemed to fall more quickly away from the city. They began to understand how easily a person could disappear here, not because the land was vast, but because it was threaded with hidden spaces, old farm tracks overgrown with weeds, abandoned sheds, deep wooded gullies. One evening, John stood at the edge of a forest trail just south of Enniskerry. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine. He imagined Annie walking ahead of him, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. In his mind, she turned once, smiling, before disappearing around a bend. When he followed, she was gone. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the wind in the trees, wondering if that was how it had been. Sudden, quiet, absolute. The Gardaí told them they would keep the file open, continue to check in on any new information. But there was no disguising the fact that without witnesses or physical evidence, the case was frozen in place. For John and Nancy, that was the cruelest part, knowing that the answer existed somewhere, but lay buried under layers of silence, chance, and time. In the villages and along the mountain roads, life continued as it always had. The buses still came and went, the pub still filled with music on weekends, the hills still rolled out toward the horizon, and somewhere in that landscape the last traces of Annie's steps were waiting, invisible now, but real as the shadow she had left on everyone who knew her. What they didn't yet realize was that in the years to come, her case would become one of the most enduring mysteries in modern Ireland, a story that refused to fade, even as the land kept its secrets close. By autumn of 1993, the air in Dublin had turned sharper, the evenings coming earlier, the sea winds cutting more deeply through the narrow streets. For the McCarricks, the season's change marked 6 months without Annie. Time, which had once felt like a precious window to find her, now stretched in strange ways, sometimes moving too fast, as days slipped away without news, and sometimes painfully slow, each hour heavy with waiting. The Gardaí had settled into a steady but quiet handling of the case. They maintained contact with John and Nancy, but there were fewer updates now, fewer calls to report on new leads. Officially, Annie's disappearance remained an open investigation, but the reality was that without fresh evidence, most efforts were reactive. The phone would ring only when a tip came in, a possible sighting in Cork, a rumour from Galway, a vague claim overheard in a pub, and then the silence would return. One such tip, in late September, drew John and Nancy back into the Wicklow Mountains. A hiker claimed to have seen a dark-coloured jacket partly buried under leaves and moss near a trail that had branched off the main road to Johnny Fox's. Search teams combed the area, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the McCarricks believed they might finally have a piece of her trail. But when the jacket was recovered, it was old and weathered, its fabric rotting at the seams. It had been there for years, far longer than Annie had been missing. The emotional whiplash of these moments took its toll. Nancy described it later as a constant swinging between hope and the pit. The hope kept them moving. The pit reminded them how far they still were from the truth. Around this time, Annie's name began appearing in articles that looked beyond her case alone. Reporters were starting to connect dots between disappearances of women in Leinster and the eastern counties, cases that, on paper, had little in common except for geography and the fact that they remained unsolved. For some, this emerging theory was a lifeline, a suggestion that perhaps there was a single answer that could explain them all. For others, it was a distraction, a way of turning individual tragedies into a single, unfocused mystery. The McCarricks avoided public speculation, but privately they began to wonder about the possibility. If Annie had been taken by someone, if she hadn't simply vanished into the folds of the mountains, then perhaps there were other families out there asking the same questions, staring at the same empty spaces. Through the colder months, John and Nancy's search grew more solitary. The media coverage had cooled. The community's initial surge of energy had softened into polite sympathy. People still recognised them in Enniskerry, still asked if there was news, but the urgency had faded. They learned that this was the rhythm of a missing person case, a burst of attention, followed by a long, slow fade into background noise. Yet they could not stop. On clear days, they still walked the roads Annie might have taken. They studied bus timetables, wondering if a missed connection had put her on the wrong stretch of road at the wrong time. They lingered near the bend where the valley opened up, imagining the last person to see her. Someone who, for reasons known only to themselves, had never come forward. The Dublin mountains loomed as they always had, silent and self-contained, their slopes rolling into one another like a tide. Whatever had happened to Annie was still out there, somewhere between the granite ridges and the quiet lanes. And as winter approached, the land seemed to close in again, its cover of frost and fog sealing over the tracks of a spring afternoon that no one could quite piece back together. If there was an answer, it was still waiting, hidden in the same place where Annie had walked, smiling into the Irish air, before vanishing into a gap in time that refused to close. By early 1994, the McCarricks had been living with Annie's absence for nearly a year, and the rhythm of their lives had shifted into something both relentless and hollow. They were no longer strangers in Dublin. They knew its streets, its bus routes, the quickest way from Sandymount to Enniskerry. Yet each familiar road was marked in their minds not by landmarks, but by questions. Every curve in the pavement felt like a fork in the mystery, a place where Annie's path might have diverged, where her story might have ended or been pulled in a direction no one had traced. The Gardaí continued to keep the file open, but there was no disguising the fact that the investigation had cooled. Officers rotated to other assignments, and while the case was never officially shelved, the constant motion of police work meant Annie's disappearance was now one file among many. The McCarricks were still treated with respect, but respect was not the same as progress. It was around this time that a journalist working on a feature about missing women in Ireland contacted them. The reporter had been studying a string of cases from the past decade, noting their geographic proximity and the striking fact that most remained unsolved. The piece would become one of the earliest public uses of the phrase vanishing triangle, and it placed Annie's photograph alongside those of other young women, Eva Brennan, Deirdre Jacob, and others whose names were unfamiliar to the McCarricks until then. The article suggested a chilling possibility, that the disappearances might be linked, perhaps even the work of a single individual. The theory wasn't new to John and Nancy. It had surfaced in hushed conversations and in the shadows of pub talk. But seeing it in print was different. It lent weight to their private fears, even as it complicated their hope. If Annie's case was part of a larger pattern, it meant there might be no personal connection, no clear reason, only the blind luck, or misfortune, of crossing paths with the wrong person. No! In the months that followed, the McCarricks began to meet other families. These were quiet gatherings, often arranged informally, where parents and siblings of the missing traded stories, theories, and the small strategies they'd learned to survive the days. There was a strange comfort in these meetings, not because they offered answers, but because they stripped away the isolation. Everyone in the room understood the peculiar kind of limbo that came from loving someone who was both gone and possibly still alive. The Gardaí continued to follow up on sporadic tips. One came from a man who claimed to have seen Annie in a pub south of Dublin weeks after she disappeared. He described her as quiet, keeping to herself, glancing often toward the door. The McCarricks listened intently, but the description unravelled under scrutiny. The date didn't match, and the details shifted in each retelling. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, March 26, 1994, Annie's case was both well-known and frustratingly opaque. Vigils were held, attended by friends, co-workers and strangers who had followed her story. Candles flickered in the cold evening air outside the bus stop in Enniskerry. People spoke about her warmth, her curiosity, her love for Ireland. But beneath the gentle words was an undercurrent of frustration, a shared awareness that the investigation was no closer to the truth than it had been on the day she vanished. That night, after the vigil, John and Nancy drove the road toward Johnny Fox's one more time. The headlights swept over stone walls and dark hedgerows, illuminating the narrow bending lane where theories had taken root but evidence had never appeared. They drove in silence, both knowing that this route, more than any other, had become the symbolic heart of the mystery. Somewhere along it, or somewhere branching from it, Annie had been last seen. And until someone spoke, until something surfaced, this ribbon of road through the mountains would remain a wound in the landscape, one that no season, no year could close. Through the mid-1990s, Annie's case existed in that uneasy space between active investigation and cold case. The Gardaí kept the file open, but without new evidence, the inquiry moved in slow, sporadic bursts. For the McCarricks, this limbo was the hardest part, knowing the machinery of the search still turned, but so quietly they could no longer hear it. They had long since returned to New York, but their lives remained tethered to Ireland. Every few months, they flew back, retracing Annie's possible routes, speaking again with the locals in Enniskerry, checking in with detectives who always greeted them kindly, but with the same resigned expressions. The village itself seemed almost unchanged each time they returned. The same cluster of shops, the same mountain air rolling down into its streets. It was as if time moved differently here, holding the same stillness that had swallowed their daughter. It was during one of these visits in 1995 that a new piece of information reached them. A private conversation relayed quietly by a man who had once worked in the mountains. He claimed that in the weeks following Annie's disappearance, there had been talk in certain circles about a sighting near a secluded turnoff, a place locals used to cut through the forest toward a small quarry. The man didn't have names, and he couldn't swear to the truth of it. But the location was close enough to the road toward Johnny Fox's that it felt impossible to ignore. The Gardaí investigated, sending officers to search the area, but by then more than 2 years had passed. The ground had shifted, vegetation had reclaimed old clearings, and whatever might have been there was long gone. No trace of Annie, no discarded clothing, no belongings, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the soft, steady drip of water down into the quarry's depths. By this point, the phrase vanishing triangle had taken firm hold in the press. Annie's name appeared regularly in lists of missing women, her smiling photograph now an emblem of the mystery. But the attention was double-edged, It kept her story alive, yet it also blurred the lines between her case and others, turning them into a kind of collective riddle for public consumption. Strangers began writing to the McCarricks, offering theories that ranged from the plausible to the outlandish. Some claimed psychic visions, others accused neighbours or passing tourists. A few insisted Annie had chosen to start a new life elsewhere. The McCarricks read every letter. They answered most of them, politely but firmly steering away from speculation that offered no actionable leads. Still, the sheer volume of voices in the void was a reminder that her story had touched people far beyond Ireland's borders, and that the hunger for an answer was not theirs alone. In 1996, a brief surge of hope came with a reported sighting in London. A woman matching Annie's description had been seen in a cafe, speaking with an American accent. The witness claimed she seemed hesitant, as if she didn't want to be noticed. The Gardaí coordinated with British authorities, but by the time they tracked down the cafe's staff, the memory of the encounter had faded. There was no CCTV, no receipt, no name, just another shadow. Each passing year etched Annie's absence deeper into the lives of those who loved her. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed. Friends married, moved, had children. And always, there was the space where she should have been. John once described it as living with a door half open, knowing it might never close, but also might never open the rest of the way. And still, the Dublin mountains stood silent, their roads winding as they always had, their valleys deep and quiet, the air shifting between mist and clear light. Somewhere in that stillness, the truth waited. Whether buried in memory, in the land itself, or in the conscience of someone who had chosen not to speak, it was there. The question, as it had been since March 26, 1993, was whether it would ever be found. By the turn of the millennium, Annie's disappearance had become part of the country's collective memory. Not a headline anymore, but a story people in Ireland seemed to carry quietly in the background. For the McCarricks, the years had blurred together into a single unbroken stretch of waiting. They no longer counted time in days or weeks, but in anniversaries. Another March 26th, another year without her. In those years, the Gardaí shifted their approach. New officers took over the file, bringing fresh eyes to the timeline, revisiting old witness statements. Technology had advanced, and there was hope that even without a crime scene, there might be new ways to cross-check records, track movements or match descriptions. But the early 1990s had been a different world. Mobile phones were rare, CCTV almost non-existent outside banks and certain public spaces, and records were often kept on paper, scattered and incomplete. Annie's last known day still rested on fragile threads: a bank withdrawal, a likely bus journey, a handful of unconfirmed sightings. During one review in the early 2000s, investigators re-interviewed a man who had been in Enniskerry the afternoon Annie disappeared. He recalled seeing a young woman with an American accent speaking to a man near the village square. He described the man vaguely: medium height, dark hair, wearing a casual jacket. But when pressed for more, the memory faltered. It had been too long, he said, too many faces since then. The Gardaí compared his account with others, but there was no clear match. John and Nancy, though older now, remained determined. They had learned to live in New York while keeping one foot in Ireland, flying back every few years to meet with detectives and revisit the landscapes where Annie's trail had ended. They noticed changes: new shops in the village, fresh paint on the bus stop, the way the hedgerows along the mountain road seemed thicker, swallowing more of the view. But the feeling was always the same, that Annie was just beyond reach, hidden somewhere in the folds of those hills. In 2005, media attention returned briefly when a journalist produced a documentary examining the unsolved cases of the Vanishing Triangle. Annie's photograph appeared early in the programme, her voice, captured in a home video, playing softly over the footage of the Dublin mountains. The documentary reignited public discussion, and for a few weeks tips began trickling in again. Most went nowhere, but one from a woman in Bray was unsettling. She claimed she'd seen a young woman fitting Annie's description walking along a coastal road days after the disappearance, accompanied by an older man. The account was vague, and the witness admitted she hadn't thought much of it at the time. But the detail that caught attention was her insistence that the young woman looked out of place and troubled. Investigators followed up, but there was nothing to connect the sighting definitively to Annie. No names, no corroboration, no evidence. Still, the McCarricks couldn't shake the image: Annie walking along a windy coastal road, close to the sea she had always loved, and yet somehow in the company of someone who didn't belong. The years continued to pass, and the case remained a ghost in the Garda records, present but untouchable. Yet for John and Nancy, each trip to Ireland still ended the same way. standing somewhere between Sandymount and the Dublin Mountains, looking out at a landscape both beautiful and indifferent, and feeling the pull of all that was missing. The land hadn't given her back. It hadn't given back her last steps, her last words, or the face of the person she may have met that day. And as the calendar moved on, they began to wonder, not if the truth existed, but whether anyone would still be looking when it was finally ready to be found. By the late 2010s, more than 2 decades had passed since Annie McCarrick's disappearance, and yet her story still held a quiet, stubborn grip on the public imagination. New cases had come and gone, fresh headlines had pushed older ones aside, but in the towns and villages along the Dublin Mountains, Annie's name could still stir a flicker of recognition. Her face, smiling, framed by the long brown hair, had become part of the country's catalogue of the missing, appearing on anniversary appeals and in the occasional newspaper feature. For John and Nancy, the years had not lessened the weight of her absence. Age had made the trips to Ireland harder, but they still came when they could, walking the same roads, meeting with detectives, and visiting the landmarks that had become touchstones in the story. Time had etched itself into those places. New tarmac laid over the old bends in the mountain road, shop fronts in Enniskerry painted fresh colours, the pub at Johnny Fox's busier than they remembered. But the spaces between, the quiet lanes, the narrow verges, the wooded cutaways, looked much the same as they had in '93, as if the years had passed without touching them. It was around this period that cold case reviews were gaining momentum in Ireland. Advances in forensic science, coupled with a growing public appetite for resolution in long unsolved cases, pushed some investigations back into active status. In Annie's case, the review meant re-examining every scrap of existing evidence, interviewing witnesses who had been silent for decades, and rechecking alibis given in the days after she vanished. Detectives hoped that time might have loosened someone's reluctance to speak, that memories once clouded by fear or uncertainty might now be clearer. One name emerged from the early review, a man who had lived near the mountain road in 1993, known locally but never closely tied to Annie's case. His history was troubling: minor offences, a reputation for being unpredictable, and an interest in young women who passed through the area. He had been interviewed at the time, but with nothing concrete linking him to Annie, he had faded from focus. Now, with renewed attention, detectives spoke to him again. The conversation yielded nothing conclusive, but it was enough to rekindle theories that Annie may have encountered someone she didn't know well, someone whose presence on that road would have seemed unremarkable to passers-by. Around the same time, a witness came forward claiming to have been in Johnny Fox's the night of Annie's disappearance. They believed they might have seen her there, or someone who looked very much like her, in the company of 2 men. The description was vague, the memory blurred by the passage of 20-plus years, and yet it was enough to stir both hope and unease. If true, it meant Annie had reached the pub, a detail that could shift the entire focus of her last hours. But without corroboration, it remained a tantalizing thread without a knot. The media seized on the renewed investigation, bringing Annie's case back into national discussion. Her photograph appeared on news sites and television screens, paired with interviews from her parents. John spoke about the importance of keeping her name alive. Nancy, her voice quieter but steady, reminded viewers that behind the mystery was a real person, a daughter who loved books, who laughed easily, who had made Ireland her home. For a few months, the renewed interest sparked fresh tips, but as had happened before, most led nowhere. Some were sincere but mistaken, others were vague rumours that dissolved under scrutiny. Still, the McCarricks understood the value of keeping her story in the public eye. Every article, every interview was a reminder, to the public, to the Gardaí, perhaps even to the person responsible, that Annie had not been forgotten. The Dublin Mountains still held their quiet counsel. The road to Johnny Fox's remained narrow and winding, the hedgerows thick and close. For those who remembered that spring day in 1993, the landscape was more than just scenery. It was a map of unanswered questions. Somewhere along it, Annie had crossed an invisible threshold, stepping into a space from which she had never returned. And even after 25 years, the hope remained that the same land that had kept its silence might, one day, give up the truth.